All right. Thank you so much for joining us today, everybody. I appreciate your patience as we got everything started. I'd like to introduce our speaker today. Jordan Levine is the Senior Vice President and Chief Economist at the California Association of Realtors. Jordan is responsible for CAR's housing market and economic research, as well as policy analysis for CAR's legislative and governmental affairs efforts. He has a passion for home ownership, fair housing, and housing supply, and regularly represents CAR to its members, industry groups, policymakers, and in the media. Thank you so much for presenting today, Gordon.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. And actually, you guys are the first ones to get me since we released our 2025 economic forecast in Long Beach last week. So yeah, it's hot off the presses, and it's pretty much our latest and greatest look at what we think is going to happen in the economy, in the housing market. I'm going to share my screen so that you guys don't have to look at my face the whole time, but I will also point out that I'll try and keep an eye on the chat and the Q&A. So to the extent that anything comes up along the way and you want me to stop or pause or anything like that, just let me know and we'll try and address those in real time. And if not, I'll make sure to save some time at the end as well. I should also point out I'll make sure to send these slides to Laura. So to the extent that you find any tidbit or nugget that's helpful to kind of chat through with your clients, then you'll have access to all of that information as well. So I think juggled a lot of different analogies for how we kind of encapsulate where we're at right now, and I ended up going with a kind of medical analogy with the idea that we kind of are off life support. The worst is behind us, but at the same time, we've got a long road to recovery. And so even as things are going to improve and you're going to see the number of transactions going up, there's going to be more supply. Prices probably aren't going to decline at all, and in fact will probably keep going up. Even as all of that stuff happens, it's important for us to really not take it for granted, because there's still a lot of challenges out there, structural and otherwise. You know, if you look at the kind of immediate stuff, that's where things are finally starting to look pretty rosy, right? We've got inflation that continues to fade and trend towards that 2% target. The Federal Reserve is finally normalizing monetary policy after a tightening cycle that really threw a monkey wrench into the housing market for sure, but into most parts of the economy as well. We also see some of these big demographic shifts that happen in the immediacy of the pandemic, where you had a lot of people leaving urban metros due to lockdown and other reasons, remote work, etc., made big jumps into places that used to be second home markets, vacation home markets, more rural areas, and that really maintained for a few years. But as we've seen the economy pick back up, as we've seen folks to a certain extent return to the office, we're not at 0% remote work anymore, but there's more people working in the office than there was before. And just the fact that folks want to get out of their house, we've seen some of those kind of demographic patterns normalize, where folks are actually buying houses in the city again. And even beyond that, you see those kind of typical migration patterns resuming, where you've got folks that work in urban downtown LA looking to places that are, kind of typically bedroom communities. They're in close commutable proximity, places like Simi Valley and things like that, as opposed to going out to Big Bear or Lake Tahoe, right? So those kind of remotable markets starting to grow again after this kind of one-time shock from the pandemic. The other thing is that the economy looks like we might actually end up escaping with that soft landing that everybody was hoping for. At least the financial markets are becoming increasingly optimistic that we're going to be able to avoid that kind of worst case scenario for a recession next year. So those are all kind of positive trends, right? Moving in the right direction. Normalizing, I think, is a big theme when you think about it through the lens of all of these shocks that we've suffered through over the course of the last 3 or 4 years. So why don't I want you to throw it in cruise control? It's because even as these very acute issues that really only rose to the fore over the last handful of years are subsiding, we've got a lot of pre-existing conditions first and foremost, and Simi Valley and Ventura County in particular are no stranger to this. But housing supply and particularly new development is going to really constrain our ability to jump back quickly to those 500,000 units of sales that we were doing back when rates were at 3% and everybody was taking advantage of that once in a lifetime opportunity to move. So that's going to put a ceiling on how many home sales that we can generate. There's going to be a recovery. Things are going to keep getting better, but not to the extent where you can just throw it in autopilot and kick your feet up on the desk and ride the wave. Listings are still going to be tight, although improved, right? Affordability is still very strained. And so both buyers and sellers, I think, need us now more than ever. But those challenges are still, the long-standing ones are largely unaddressed because we've been so focused on the immediate term. And then, of course, on top of these 30-year challenges that we've been grappling with for a long time, we've got all kinds of new challenges, right? We've got industry changes, we've got insurance issues. There's a lot of things that mean that it's still pretty hard for even a gainfully employed, relatively high income person in California to make that leap into home ownership. And so even as those cyclical issues are fading and we'll be kind of having that economic and market wind at our back instead of blowing directly in our face next year, it's not going to be blowing so hard again that you can take your foot off the gas. And that's kind of brings me to my next point, which is that the way the next few years and decades shakes out is largely going to be a function of what we do, over the near term to start addressing some of these issues. There are some rays of hope, even on housing supply. We're building a little bit more now, and we've had some policy victories that I think are both, worth celebrating, but also should hopefully motivate us to get more active in the policy arena because we do have the power to make some kind of dent in this problem, even as some of this stuff is external. We also have, I think, a lot of untapped potential on housing. As bad as supply is, as hard as affordability is in the state right now, we've still got a lot of very high income, gainfully employed renters that don't realize they're already paying somebody's mortgage. It just happens to be their landlords. And when you ask, do you want to own a home, they get it. But they don't have a lot of financial literacy, right? You ask them what they need to get into a house and they really don't have a clue. That's a challenge for us, clearly, but also an opportunity, right? Because you can solve that one with just some good information and kind of myth busting. And I think that's where we have the opportunity again to move the needle, regardless of what happens with rates, what the Fed does, macro economy, because you got a lot of six-figure income renters out here in California. The other way I think that we can move the needle ourselves, again, regardless of that external environment, is by evangelizing for buying homes in the winter, right? Like I know there's a spring home buying season and everybody likes to move, once their kids are out of school and before they have to start the next year, and you're already worried about holidays and the rest of that stuff. But assuming that you're okay with a little bit of inconvenience, it's actually fairly advantageous as a home buyer in winter, all things equal. And I think you put that together with some of the recent trends, rate cuts, some uncertainty going away with the election being in the rearview mirror as we get towards the end of this year, that there's a chance that we could see an unseasonably strong winter that would kick off a better recovery for next year. So the bottom line for us is to be optimistic. Things are getting better. We have the economy continuing to grow. We have transactions continuing to go up. We have prices that are also going to go up as rates go down. But I think the thing that's key for buyers to realize is that, this idea of waiting around means saving money is a myth. If you look at the history in California, and this is true regardless of whether we're in an election year or not, the longer you wait, the more challenging it's been to get your foot on the property ladder. That's what folks should be worried about. It's a long-term game. And I think reminding folks that housing is a long-term game, right? That the number one best time to buy a house in California was 20 years ago. But the second best time is as soon as you possibly can, because over the long run, prices only ever go one way. Forget about trying to time the market. Forget about your brother-in-law who told you you're going to be able to buy some foreclosures later this year. The key is to get in as soon as you can. If rates drop a bunch, you can refi and you take advantage of those savings. But in the meantime, you're paying down principal and building up equity, which is something you can't do until you actually purchase the home. You can always go back and refi a loan that you originated at a higher rate, but you can never go back 3 years and get that equity on that house that you didn't even own at the time. That's what housing's all about. And I think that if we do some of these things, then we can even accelerate the forecast that I'm about to present to you here. Before we get too deep into the forecast for 25, I just kind of wanted to do a little bit of a post-mortem on 2024 to explain why we didn't have the robust recovery this year that I and others, frankly, were hoping for. And it's because the bond market has just been so incredibly volatile. You can see as early as June of 2022, the bond market has gone through about 6 or 7 different peaks in 10-year treasury rates. And those are the rates that directly feed through to 30-year fixed rate mortgages. And unfortunately, the bond market has just been overly optimistic time and time again. In June, they thought that those rate cuts, June of 22, they thought rate cuts were right around the corner. Bond buyers poured back into the treasury market. And then lo and behold, the economic data stayed strong. And by the fall of that year, they were pulling out of the bond market. Rates went back up, peaking again in October of that year. But then they became optimistic again. Maybe we're going to get those rate cuts and bond prices go up, rates go down. Same thing in December of 22, March of 23, October of 23, May of 24. And every time we've had this kind of bond market freak out, it's really stalled the nascent recovery. If you look at the forecast that I presented to you all in Long Beach, or maybe that was in Anaheim last year, October of last year, we said that we were going to fall from about a 5% 10-year treasury rate to about a 4% T-bill rate this year. And if you look, on average, we pretty much achieved the forecast that I suggested, where we were going to gradually creep down. Unfortunately, it wasn't a gradual linear decline to that sub 4% 10-year treasury rate. It looked a lot like my weight loss journey, right? It's like, yeah, it used to be 235 pounds. Now I'm 180, but it didn't happen without first going down to 170, then back up to $195, and finally landing at 180 pounds. And that volatility has really kind of stalled what was otherwise shaping up to be a fairly robust recovery. You can see that every time the bond market got optimistic about the rate cuts, very shortly thereafter, buyer demand turns around, those mortgage applications pick up. But once they realize they missed the boat and reverse course, dramatic pullbacks on the buyer demand side. They get optimistic again in October. Things shoot back up during the spring of this year. But then, of course, the CPI and jobs numbers remain strong. So the rate went back up and home buyer demand stalled out after shaping up pretty good in the first quarter of this year. So, if you look at what that means in terms of where we're going to land this year, a year ago, I told you we were going to end up with about a 320 to 330,000 unit pace. I hope you all aren't seeing a large gray box on the bottom right of my screen.
We are. Is that part of the slideshow or?
No, it's not. Let me unshare.
Because it sort of looked like a graphic at first, but then it's covering up some of the data.
Interesting. Well, let's see. How about that? Can you still see it?
Yeah.
What about if I do that? Still bad?
It's still there. Yeah.
Yeah, I have nothing on my screen. I really don't
Oh,
know
strange.
what
Yeah, because it's coming across on my screen as well. It's on the bottom right.
right here.
Yeah.
Oh, weird. I only see white. I don't know what I can move. Hold on.
Well,
Let's see if I can fix it.
Okay. And you'll be sharing your slides, I know, with us, so we will be able to email these out to all the attendees as well. So Sorry about that, everybody.
Yeah, I sincerely apologize. I have no idea. I'm doing a
I-
normal screen share as I've
yeah.
always done on the last 600 Zooms. So let me try it one more time. And
Thanks,
if
Jordan.
not, then we'll soldier through and I'll make sure that you get the slides on the back end. So thank you
Thank you.
for letting me know.
Hey, it's gone.
Oh my gosh, God bless. Okay, great. So
Thank you.
um I don't know what I did, but it's good that it's gone. And ultimately, the moral of the story here was just that we had to continuously downgrade our forecast throughout the year because of that bond market volatility. So October of 23, we were telling you it was going to be about a 330,000 unit year, which would have equated to about a 23% increase. By March of this year, I had to downgrade that to a 291,000 unit pace. Still a double digit increase, but not quite as strong as what we had originally projected. And in Long Beach last week, I actually downgraded it even further to a 275,000 unit pace. And that's simply because even though the kind of trajectory of the economy, of the housing market, no major shocks have come down the pike, that hypersensitivity to interest rates coupled with over optimism on the part of the bond market, again, just really took a lot of the wind out of our sails. So things did get better this year. If you look at the yellow stuff here, those are the transactions through August of this year, and they are better than where they were in 2023, but not so much so that it kind of dwarfs and gave us that great over performance that we were hoping for. Prices continue to rise, and I think this is important for buyers to understand because there is that kind of brother-in-law effect where folks are being told that rates are going to come down a lot more probably than they really will, that prices are on the precipice of collapsing, and you're going to swoop in and get yourself an REO at a super bargain basement price with another 3% mortgage rate. And in fact, if you look at the price numbers for 14 months in a row now, prices have been going up, not down. So every month that you've waited and listened to your brother-in-law is every month that affordability has deteriorated. And in fact, even as rates have come down a little bit, once you put them together with prices, that net effect is that your purchasing power is still worse than it was a year ago. So get out of this mindset of timing the market, of waiting to save. The fundamentals don't support any price declines. And if anybody looks even half close at the Fed report from 2 weeks ago, the outlook for rates isn't precipitous declines. And in fact, you can already benefit from the rate cuts that they already did. Even though prices have gone up, one of the things that we're seeing in a more normalized market environment is that things are normalizing, right? If you go back to 2020 and 21, when we were enjoying the lowest interest rates of all time, we had back-to-back years of double-digit price growth adding up to a cumulative about 35% increase, depending on what market you were actually in. Of course, you can see as rates started to go up in 22 and 23, that price growth started to kind of revert back to norm. And if you look at the right-hand side of this chart, I'm breaking down 2024 monthly, and you can see that, as we were having that strong recovery in that first quarter of the year, price growth was a lot stronger. But prices, as inventories come up, that price growth is starting to normalize back down to kind of more normal levels in that mid-single digit range. And I expect that to be the case. In the local market, mostly see a similar story. If you look at like Simi Valley for the year as a whole, first 8 months, right? You see that prices are up about 5%, sales are down a little bit, and inventory's up. And if you look at just the month of August, in isolation, prices are actually up a little bit more, but sales are doing actually a little bit better. Moorpark looks pretty similar to the state as a whole. The whole year price growth is about 6%, sales up about 4%. August as a whole had prices up a little bit less than that, just 3.5%. So that same kind of normalizing pattern that we see statewide, where there's slightly lower rates, little bit more inventory, it's helping to normalize that price. You see that same stuff kind of happening in the local market. The first 8 months are a lot stronger than the most recent months. So again, you get that kind of over performance in the first half of the year that we had statewide, and then that little bit of slowing that we're seeing as rates came up. The good news on the economic front, though, is that, and let me check. It looks like I've got some Q&A. It says Speaking of policy, CAR would add greatly to the home supply if it would encourage Congress to raise the capital gains tax deduction for seniors in high-priced areas and would motivate many people to sell. This person finds many seniors staying in their homes or renting them out rather than selling. Baby boomers are still the largest. Absolutely agree with every single thing that you said. The only tweak I would make to that is instead of saying if we encourage Congress, I would say if we continue to encourage Congress, because we actually are one of the few state organizations that has our own federal lobbyist that lobbies Congress people in New York. And actually he is habitually bugging every member of Congress and has been doing so for the last 5 years to double that capital gains threshold. And actually I credit this individual with some of the success, or credit at least, for getting it out of just a kind of brainstorming and into and through committee such that it might actually go up for a vote this year. So absolutely agree with the sentiment in terms of what that would do to benefit California's housing market, just with the caveat that we've already been applying an enormous amount of pressure on that specific issue and will continue to do so. So thank you for that. Thank you for that comment. I have another question from Chuck. I love getting questions from Chuck. He said that the sales to list price ratio for Simi Valley was 100%, but there was 35% of these actives had a reduced price. So yes, so like we are looking at active listings that are, so the sales to list price is looking at only closed sales. So what did it close at and how does that compare to what it was on the market at right before it went pending? The actives with a price reduction are ones that are still active, not pending or under contract. And it's just looking at the percentage of those that are still active that have a price that's lower than where they came onto the MLS. And I hope that helps, but it's kind of measuring two different populations, and actually both of them kind of suggest that the market's very competitive. It's just kind of two ways to look at the competitiveness question. Thank you for that, Chuck. And actually, I should shout out for Chuck. You guys are very lucky to have such an amazing Gad who's so plugged in. I'm like worried about my job every time Chuck sends his newsletter out. So again, on the economic front, a lot of these major I don't know the bill number from anonymous attendee for the capital gains thing, but I know the name of it, and it's got a big clunky name, but it's called the More Homes Available for Sale on the Market Act. The sponsor of the bill is Jimmy Panetta, who happens to be my congressperson here in the Central Coast. He's a Californian. He's a Democrat, but he actually gets the need, and the impact, the kind of chain reaction on housing supply and housing affordability and all of that stuff. So it's called the More Homes Available for Sale on the Market Act, and the sponsor is Jimmy Panetta. And hopefully if you Google that, it'll give you enough breadcrumbs to actually find the bill number. Love these questions. Thank you so much. I love having an engaged thing. That means that I'm saying something that's resonating, even if for good or bad. Economically, though, I think, we are trending in the right direction, and the market is going to be a kind of net positive for us this year. You can see that we're down below 3% on inflation and trending towards that 2% Fed target. Really, the last vestige of inflation is housing costs, both rent and prices. The pandemic-driven shortage inflation is gone. A lot of the labor market shortage it's not completely gone, but it has subsided incredibly. But for really, still robust growth in home prices, this stuff would already be back to target, and it will probably continue to trend in the right direction, aka the Fed will be able to, kind of take their foot off the gas and deliver more rate cuts. I talked about how the labor markets were way out of whack a few years ago in the wake of the pandemic. We had a labor shortage of almost 6.2 million workers. That shrunk pretty consistently. We're now below a million workers short. Still a shortage, which is pretty unprecedented by historical standards. And actually one of the reasons why we've seen such robust wage growth that was driving a lot of the second wave of inflation. but moving in the right direction and almost to a balanced labor market where we should see again those wage numbers subside, or at least, the growth in wages, and give us some of that easing inflation that we were hoping for. The other big piece of macroeconomic news, I think, is that the yield curve, which is the econ nerds way of, oh my gosh, thank you so much. That's HR 1321. Love it. Yeah, so respond to every red alert and call and bug your congressperson, because if they made that happen, we estimate there's I think about 2.7 million people locked in by capital gains right now, just because they've lived in their homes so long that the house has appreciated to the point where they're going to owe capital gains. And if we double that threshold, I think that number drops to about a million who will still be locked in by capital gains, but that represents about 1.7 million potential transactions, or at least homes that could come on the market. And not everybody's going to move just because of this bill, but even if 10% do, 10% of a couple of million adds up to those are real numbers. So thank you for that, whoever you are. Appreciate it. Yeah, in terms of whether we're going to see a recession, the bond market says no. This yield curve is really all it's doing is measuring the spread between 10-year treasuries and 2-year treasuries. And I won't belabor this boring, esoteric macro stuff. I will just say that it's supposed to be in positive territory. And when it goes negative, that's what we as economists call an inversion of the yield curve. But it really just symbolizes the fact that the bond market's really scared about short-term prospects for the economy. So they don't buy 2-year treasuries, meaning that the price for 2-year treasuries goes down and the rate for 2-year treasuries goes up. That causes the yield curve to invert. Whenever that's happened in the past, it's like 99% of the time been followed by a recession 12 to 18 months down the road. So the fact that this is now back in positive territory after having been negative sustained for 2 years continuously is noteworthy. That at least the bond market thinks that the Fed might actually pull off this soft landing and avoid a recovery, because the appetite for 2-year treasuries has started to come back over the last 3 weeks. And of course, on top of that, we've got the Fed that's finally putting their thumb on the scale for us in our direction. So back on September 17th, they cut the Fed funds rate by 50 basis points, which was kind of at the upper end of what folks were hoping for. If you look at the guidance coming out of that meeting, the new trajectory of the Fed funds rate is what I'm showing you in orange compared to what they had forecasted for us back in June. And you can see that ultimately it means that next year's interest rate will probably be 50, 60 basis points lower than what they had originally anticipated, but that the medium and long term are essentially unchanged. In fact, maybe even slightly higher. So this idea of waiting for rates, I think, is very misplaced. If you extrapolate that Fed funds rate onto mortgage rates and try and get the implications of that, it means that instead of about a 6.6% interest rate next year, we might get as low as a 5.9% annual average. Guess what? Rates last week on the Mortgage News Daily were already 6%. If you get a motivated seller to give you a rate buy down, you could already probably do better than what the projected interest rate's going to be for next year. The improvement in interest rates is going to be incremental at best. This idea that rates are going to drop back down to 3 or 4%, meaning that it behooves you to wait, is very misplaced if you simply just look at what the Fed's telling us they're going to do. It's not complicated math. This is basic arithmetic to add mortgage rate spreads and realize that, rates aren't going to look that much different in the near term from where they are right now. In fact, it's funny when you look at what happened in the wake of the Fed rate cut announcement. The Fed cut rates on September 17th, and on September 18th, mortgage rates actually went higher. And that's because the bond market moves in anticipation of the Fed. If they wouldn't have cut by 50 basis points, you would have seen the mortgage rate spike back up, because the bond market wouldn't have got their pound of flesh that they were demanding. But to me, this really underscores why you don't want to wait around for rates, right? Because the market's moving ahead of rates. You could have benefited from the Fed rate cut back in August. The market had already priced that in. You didn't need to wait around for the Fed to act to take advantage of that in the marketplace. The other point is that rates last week were the best they've been in years, right? You have to go all the way back to the fall of 22 to find a point in time when rates were lower than they were last week. And so, don't wait around for rates. Rates last week were not just good compared to, kind of where we've been in the wake of the pandemic. They're just objectively good. This is a 50-year history of 30-year fixed rate mortgages. The gray stuff shows you every point in time when rates were as high or higher than they were last week. And you can see that it's almost always, right? Rates are almost always higher than they were last week. So this idea of waiting, like the anomaly was the 3%. 6% is not the anomaly. 6% is better than average. The average over the last 40 years for 30-year fixed rate mortgages is 6.8%. So we were already 70 basis points better than that last week. In fact, the only time you can find sustained periods where we do better than what we did last week in terms of interest rates was when the dot-com bubble exploded, when the housing market collapsed in 2007 through 10, and actually during COVID. In fact, if you look from 16 to 2019, we were already trending back to a 6% mortgage rate after the housing collapse. But for the pandemic, we would have already been back at 6% a long time ago. So this idea of thinking that you're going to do better than 6%, I think is, if you look at least historically, it's a myth, barring some major economic catastrophe. And guess what? If you buy now and there ends up being another economic catastrophe that pushes rates down to 3% again, you refi, your payment goes down a boatload. And in the interim, you've made a bunch of wealth in terms of appreciation and principal paid down on that house. So that's all the kind of good stuff, right? The bad stuff is that we still got a housing shortage, right? Even in the 2000s to 2010, well, actually, let me back up. Look at the beginning of this chart, right? If you go back to the 70s, when we were about a 20 million person state, we were building about 2.2 million units every 10 years, right? In the 80s, we built about 2.1 million. And then 70s, we built about 2.2 million. By the 90s, that had dropped to just 1.1 million by the 2000s. And this was our housing boom years, right? That was when we were overbuilding, quote unquote. We got to make sure to use the air quotes there. We built 800,000 fewer units during our housing boom when we were a 40 million person state than we did in the 1970s when we were a 20 million person state. So this is why there's a ceiling to home sales in California. This is why we struggled even before the pandemic to generate more than 3 months of supply when 6 used to be considered the norm, and why even as the macro economy is going to help us in those policies, rate policy is going to normalize, demographic trends are going to normalize. I don't foresee that 500,000 unit pace of transactions coming back because we just simply don't have the homes available to sell. That's why if you look at prices in California, right? Prices go up and down, and there's economic shocks, there's housing crises, there's dot-com bubbles, there's S&L, bubbles and crashes and all of that kind of stuff. But if you look at the long-term trend in California, as soon as the dust settles on any given economic shock, be it housing, stock market, what have you, prices almost immediately resume that long-term upward trend that is a function of not having enough homes. Too many people, too many jobs, lots and lots of income, and not enough roofs to put all of that demand underneath, which is how you end up with charts like this. Yes, shocks happen to the economy, things go up, things go down, but as soon as the dust settles, prices start going right back up. In fact, if you've got buyers waiting to time the market and get in when prices are at rock bottom, I'm telling people, like, you got to jump in the DeLorean and punch it to 88 and go back to last October, because prices have actually been rising for over a year straight now. And the longer you wait, the harder it is to break into home ownership. In fact, even with rates that have come down a little bit recently, housing affordability in California now is at its lowest level it was at, or it's been at, since the housing bubble back in 2006, 7, 8, and 9. Back then, we hit a trough of only 12% housing affordability. And we're not too far off that now. So waiting means doing yourself a disservice. You want the affordability, you want the house to be as cheap as humanly possible. And the longer we wait, the more expensive California has become historically. And you don't have to be a great forecaster to predict that. That's why if you look at the far end of this chart on the left, California's homeownership rate in yellow is way depressed compared to the green one, which is the US homeownership rate. We're running about an 11 percentage point gap with the rest of the United States. And I know you can't read this chart, but all these blue bars are our 140 largest cities in California. And I only show you this to show you how many of those fall below the orange 50% threshold. And it just ultimately means that home ownership is getting farther and farther out of reach the longer that folks stay out of the market. In fact, 38 of our largest cities in California are already majority renter, and it includes all your favorite acronyms, right? Your LAs, your SFs, your SDs, your SBs, you name it, right? 6 out of 10 of the largest cities are already majority renter. And so even as the economy is probably going to hold up well, even as rates are going to continue to fall, our clients, right? The would-be home buyers out there are still up against it, which kind of makes me optimistic because they really need us now more than ever. But it also means that we've really got our work cut out for us too. And just because the cyclical stuff is going to be in the rear view mirror, you're probably still going to have to work just as hard as you have the last couple of years, just for different reasons, right? Because they really need our assistance. We're not grappling with all these crazy anomalies and economic shocks, but we are still facing considerable structural hurdles to getting people into home ownership. Another one of those is on the insurance front, right? We've been asking folks about insurance now for the last handful of years. And even since 2023, the percentage of realtors that we surveyed last year that said they had buyers with difficulty obtaining insurance, that number's doubled. It was 16% in our survey last year. This year, about a third of the members who responded said they had clients, buyers that were struggling to get insurance. Either it wasn't available, it was too expensive, they couldn't afford it, what have you. And it's not just in the rural markets. What's so interesting about this chart to me is that, yes, the vacation and second home markets, places like your Tahoes and your Big Bears, those numbers are considerable. Half of folks saying that they're struggling with insurance issues. But even in the downtowns, right? Like even in more urbanized areas with lower fire risk, and I think this really underscores and illustrates how the way that we fund our insurer of last resort is actually impacting the entire insurance market. You could live in San Jose or LA downtown where, the risk of a wildfire is minimal, but you're still struggling with either premium or availability of insurance, because if something happens in Big Bear, Mammoth, or Tahoe or something like that, all insurers in California are on the hook for that according to market share, regardless of whether you actually write policies in that geography or not. And so, you don't even want to write in LA because you're still on the hook for something bad happening in Big Bear. And so it's not just a rural market issue. The insurance stuff is spilling across the board, and it's ultimately just raising the cost of housing and reducing affordability. And I think no matter how this gets solved, and I think they'll figure something out, some way to keep the insurers here or pass on reinsurance. But I think the thing that doesn't change is that insurance doesn't ever become any cheaper here, because they're pricing in the risk, and ultimately they see that as a risky gamble. In fact, 13% of our members this year said they didn't just have difficulty or have buyers with difficulty, but 13% of our members actually had at least one transaction fall out due to some kind of an insurance issue. So that's why I say, don't take your foot off the gas. Don't take it for granted, even though rates are coming down and the economy is going to continue to grow. The thing that has me the most optimistic, though, is that the benefits of home ownership, that long view of housing and why you get into housing, remains completely undiminished by the current challenges that we face. If you look at the typical household in the United States, their wealth in real terms is about $192,000. That's if you take all Americans and just dump them into one big pot and say, what's the middle person's wealth in there if you line them up from highest to lowest? Well, if you take that pot and separate it out into two pots and put buyers, or excuse me, homeowners into one and renters in another, and look at the median wealth there, it becomes so blatantly and clearly and empirically obvious why people should be getting into the housing market in California as soon as they can. The longer you stay renting, the longer you're prolonging your ability to generate any wealth. Renters in the most recent data were just as poor as they've always been. And even though you get people showing you hypothetical models on paper where somebody stays a renter or stays living in their mom's basement and buys a bunch of gold and Bitcoin and all that stuff and achieves even more wealth than they would have got by buying their own home. This chart shows us that those are, hypothetical thought experiments that never materialized in real life. Homeowners are the only ones in this country who have ever accumulated any wealth. And when you stay a renter, you don't do all this whiz bang financial investing. You consume more, you spend all your money, you live at your mom's house, but drive a 7 Series BMW to try and, impress the girls or something like that. You don't end up actually accumulating any wealth. So forget about trying to time the market. Get in as soon as you can, camp out there, and set your kids up and grandkids for an even better life than the one that you were, had. That's to me what home ownership's all about. The other reason to be optimistic isn't just that the benefits of home ownership are alive and well, but also that there's some reasons that we might see some progress. I know it's not, really clear and apparent, but if you squint at this chart, the last couple of years we have seen a modest uptick in new construction, and to me that is the kind of limiting factor in how many homes we're going to be able to sell every year. So these numbers are actually finally moving in the right direction. And not only are they higher, a lot of that growth, actually, in fact, almost all of the growth has come from ADUs. So this is a chart of just the amount of ADUs that we've built. And you can see that it went from basically no ADUs at all, right, to about 25 to 30,000 a year over the course of the last 2 to 3 years. And if you back up, that explains almost the entirety of this uptick in all residential permits, right? So, but for the ADUs, we'd still just be grinding along at about 100,000 units a year. So this is both good news in and of itself, because we certainly need the units, as I showed you before. But I also think it's very encouraging that when we get active on policy and when we apply pressure to policy makers at the local, at the state, and hopefully we'll get some help on supply even at the national level where they're finally starting to talk about this stuff. It can actually make a difference. So these are good numbers and encouraging in and of themselves, but it's hopefully a shot in the arm for us that when we use our collective voice to advocate for supply, to improve affordability and boost home ownership, that we can, in fact, move the needle, and we're seeing the fruits of those labors here. That being said, though, supply is going to stay tight. You've still got about 2/3 of homeowners locked into interest rates that are below 4%. So, three months of supply is probably going to stay the norm. Like six months of supply is probably not going to happen again, as you've got so many folks with a huge disincentive to move because they don't want to give up the lowest interest rate ever recorded in human history, right? That being said, though, even with 2/3 of homeowners locked in, and actually point number one is that used to be 3/4 of homeowners, right? So you've already got folks that have had to move, had to refi or cash out, what have you. But also, rates aren't the totality of the story when it comes to your decision to move, right? Like your house has to also still work for you. Where is Ventura on the chart of ADUs? It's not there because Ventura has really not partaken. One of the things I neglected to mention on this chart, Rich, is that almost all of those 30,000 ADUs are happening in either LA or San Diego County. It's been very geographically concentrated, and I think we need to look to Southern California as a model for how we can expedite this stuff, because they're the least unpalatable form of new development, right? Even the NIMBYs can stomach an ADU, and so I think we've got to try and replicate this more broadly across the state, because you can see that the vast majority of those units are happening in LA City, LA County, unincorporated, other incorporated communities within LA County, or San Diego. The rest are a fraction. Great question. But yeah, life happens, right? So why are people still going to move, even though there's lots of people still locked into hyper low interest rates? It's because your house still has to work for you, right? And you can't just keep shoving more and more babies into like a 3-bedroom condo or a 2-bedroom condo. Eventually you're going to need a little bit more space. And even just since the start of the pandemic, we've had 1.7 million babies born, 1.2 million people die. A lot of people have out migrated to other parts of the United States, and just other life events. They call them the 3Ds, right? Like death, divorce, dislocation. All of these things are equally as important, if not more important, than what your current interest rate is, right? I can tell you, like, personally, that when your wife gets a new boyfriend and starts dating the bartender down the street, it doesn't matter how cheap that interest rate is, you still dump that property. And I think these life events are starting to accumulate such that we will see continued progress on new housing supply. And indeed, we've already seen that start to materialize. In fact, last week, this is weekly data, we had more active listings on the market now than we have in the last 2 years consecutively. So things clearly moving in the right direction. Buyers have a lot more options now, but look at where they've risen to. They're just now finally back to where they were during the shutdown, right, in 2020. So moving in the right direction, not a cruise control environment. The other thing that's really encouraging is that consumers actually still get it. We actually asked about 1,000 California renters this year, is home ownership important to you? About 80% said yes, and that remains unchanged. We've gotten the same 4 out of 5 renters think home ownership is important. So not only are there clearly documented benefits of home ownership, renters understand those and they recognize them and they want to take advantage of it, right? We see that actually, as repeat sales have fallen because sellers are loath to give up their 3% interest rate, first time buyers are actually rising as a share of the overall marketplace, granted at a more depressed level of sales, but they don't have all the baggage that somebody with a 3% interest rate comes with, especially when they recognize those long-term benefits of home ownership. When we
Excuse me,
asked them,
Jordan, that big gray box is back.
oh my gosh, I didn't even
Like on the
do,
last, the 2 slides before, it just popped up again. I
oh
don't
my
know what's
gosh,
happening. I'm so sorry.
that's okay. Let me stop. And I think it's whenever I look at the Q&A, maybe. So maybe the moral of the story is I should be ignoring you guys. How about that? No?
No, it's still there. And yeah, if we get it off, I can take care of the Q&A. That
Okay.
way you don't have to do that. So
Yeah, I closed all my Q&A windows, but let me close the chat. I'm so sorry. I have no idea. All I'm doing is clicking share screen, I promise. Um,
yeah, it's still there. It's so weird. I've never seen anything. It's just a glitch of some kind.
yeah, that's really annoying. I'm so sorry that that's happening. Um, what happens if I do just this? Still there?
Yes,
Uh,
unfortunately.
okay. Well, there's I don't know
Yeah,
what my option is.
I'm sorry. Yeah, and we'll definitely be sharing these slides with everyone, so you'll be able to see everything.
Yeah, to be totally candid, these are visual aids just so you're not traumatized by looking at my face the whole time. So I'll make sure that I'm like covering the salient points on any of these individual slides in any case. But the good news, or maybe it's both the good and bad news, is that these renters want home ownership. They believe in it. They connect the dots on the benefits of home ownership. But what they don't understand is what it takes to actually become a homeowner. We said, how much money do you need to put down on a house to become a homeowner? About 47% thought you needed more than 20% down payments, not even just 20%, but more than 20%. 20% of renters we talked to thought you needed over 50% down to become a homeowner. So again, there's a lot of challenges ahead of us, but that seems like an easy one to fix, right? You show them that there's loan products that are cheap and that you actually don't need hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars in the bank to get your foot on the property ladder. It's really acute amongst younger folks in particular, right? If you look at Gen Z and millennial, the median Gen Z renter that we surveyed last year, the very middle answer, what's the down payment? 50%. That means that 50% of the Gen Z respondents that we talked to thought you needed more than 50% down, right? So if you live in Moore Park and there's $1 million median price and you log into Chase and there's not 500 grand sitting in there, then you don't even bother pursuing it. You just end up getting some nice rims for your BMW or something like that. So again, this is both a huge challenge and necessitates us getting really serious on financial literacy, but this also to me represents really low hanging fruit. Like, hey, do you got 30 grand in the bank? I can make this happen for you, right? And you're going to reap all those benefits. And by the way, look how good this is for you and all of that stuff. So I think, we can move the needle on this, right? 2/3 of those renters said if I could get in with less money down, I would do it, right? And to me, that's where we got to jump in and kind of channel that inner Jerry Maguire and help me help you get into home ownership and really help them kind of connect the dots on that stuff. One thing I think we need to start doing is evangelizing for the winter time because it's the best time to buy in general. And this is days on market every year, going back a number of years. But the thing, you'll see this like kind of hump effect, right? Like the market's more competitive in the spring and summer, less competitive in the winter. Meaning for me as a buyer, I want to buy when it's less competitive. Same thing if you look at prices. Prices peak in the spring and summer and they're lower in the winter. I want to buy when they're lower, right? Why are we waiting until our kids go out of school? It's kind of like waiting to go on vacation until everybody's on spring break. Then it's just crowded and icky. Better to go on vacation in, you know, September, October, once everybody's back in school and you got the place to yourself. Same idea applies. And why we haven't been evangelizing for this in housing, I think, is a missed opportunity because buyers could really, get a huge arbitrage kind of opportunity there by buying during the off season. Same thing if you look at how many people are paying over list. That number's highest in the summer and spring, lowest in the winter. So all of these charts tell us that it's, the best time to buy, aside from 20 years ago, is as soon as you can, but especially if it's in the winter because nobody else is trying to buy and you don't have to claw your way past all those pesky other buyers. So I think we have a chance for an unseasonably strong winter, particularly not just because it's a great time to buy, but the election uncertainty is going to be behind us. Joe's out, one of these guys is going to be in. We're probably going to get a few more rate cuts later this year. I just showed you why it's advantageous for you as a buyer to buy, right? On top of having lower rates and less uncertainty and all of that. And you actually have more options to choose from with inventory being at the highest levels it's been at. And I think based on the statistics, I'm not the only one who's, going through all of life's various curveballs, which will also contribute to more inventory in the coming year. People always ask about election years. I always say, don't worry about it. I love this chart. I always subscribe to Keeping Current Matters. I think they do a lot of great work, but they're like putting out stuff like this, like home sales have gone up in 9 out of the last 11 elections, right? So, or like prices are up in 7 out of the last 8 elections. It's like, duh. If you look at this chart, prices are almost always up, whether it's an election year or not. The anomaly is when prices are down, not up. So to me, yeah, prices are up after an election. That's because we never build enough and prices are almost always up. So to me, don't worry about elections. Forget about timing the market, timing rates, timing elections. Like prices only ever go one way long term. Get in as soon as you can, camp out. If rates go down a ton, you refi, you take advantage. Nothing stops you from doing that. And I think that we're going to see continued improvement up to 304,000 units. That's better than it was last year and better than it was the year before as well. But you can see that still leaves us with quite a gap in terms of where we were when rates were back at 3%. So foot on the gas to get those transactions done, and buyers still need us, more than ever. But I do think we're seeing some early warning signs of a strong, unseasonably strong winter. Pending numbers are kind of holding up, whereas they should already have been dropping off pretty precipitously by this point in the year. Geographically, there's not going to be a lot to distinguish because it's such a macro driven show. I do think that you'll see the top end continue to outperform as it's done throughout the entirety of this cycle, but it's really going to be about price segments, with the top end of the income spectrum driving better growth at the top end of the price spectrum. But outside of that, not much to distinguish one geography for another. Rates will come down, but we're forecasting a 5.9% mortgage rate for next year. You can almost already achieve that in the marketplace, depending on what your credit score looks like, how motivated the seller is to throw a couple bucks at a buy down, and all that stuff. So I would not wait around for rates, because prices are only going to get worse. We have a new all-time high price coming in next year. And even though rates are going to be lower, when you put rates together with prices, affordability is still going to get worse. So forget what your brother-in-law told you. The best time to buy is as soon as you can. If you haven't already bought, economy isn't going to fall apart. And I know I've gone on forever and ever, so I won't belabor these, but you'll be able to look at these. But slower growth, but still moving forward. Housing market to experience a double-digit increase in transactions next year. Prices that keep going up, and affordability that only gets worse even as rates fall to that 5.9 unit level. So help your clients see the forest for the trees. Step up your game, because your clients actually really need you now more than ever, with all these changes, with the RPA being as high or as crazy as it is, with just the market being as competitive as it is. And I think if you do that, evangelize for the winner, get people long-term, not short-term focused, and just bring it in terms of your skills and expertise and your ability to be that trusted advisor. And if you do that, I have absolutely no concerns for your 2025. And in fact, I think sky's the limit. So with that, I would say thank you for indulging me and suffering through all of the shenanigans with that mystery gray box. And thank you for the opportunity to present.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Any other questions before we go? I think we're good with, all right, and I will be sharing the slides with everyone who attended. And Jordan, thank you again. Your information is always so helpful and popular with our members, and we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us today.
Thank you so much. I hope that helped, and we'll see you on the next one.
All right, you take care. Bye, everybody.